Welcome back, everyone, to Always Believe in God, where we encourage you to believe in God throughout life's most difficult challenges and struggles in life. So, today I want to talk to you about feeling rejected by God. I don't know if you've ever felt rejected by God. I think it's one thing to feel rejected by man, but it's another thing to feel rejected by God. So, I struggled with infertility for many years in my life, probably from the time I was in my late 20s until I was about 37 or 38. And today I want to talk to you about Abraham and Sarah. If you've ever been churched, or if you've not even been church, if you're unchurched, I'm sure you've heard about Abraham and Sarah. So in Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis 21, Abraham and Sarah struggled with infertility. God had promised Abraham since he was around age 75, and Sarah was like 10 years younger than him. So let's say she was age 65 in Genesis 12. He had promised them that he was going to be a father of many nations. But as time went by, they didn't have a child. So much so that in Genesis 18, almost 10 years later, Sarah volunteers her maidservant to Abram, her husband. That's before God changed their name from to Abraham and Sarah. It was Abram and Sarai. And it's 10 years later, after God had promised them that they would have a child, and they still hadn't had any children. So, like many of us as women, we like to control our circumstances because we feel like God is taking too long. And Abraham and Sarah, Abram and Sarai, Sarah gave her husband to her maidservant Hagar, and Abram and Hagar had Ishmael. But this was after Sarah had waited 10 years for God's promise. So I believe Abraham was like 86 when he had Ishmael. And Sarah, of course, got mad at Hagar because Hagar also despised despised Sarah because she had a child, Ishmael, with her husband. And Sarah still had no child. But I hope you guys understand. I can understand why she felt she was giving up. So using her method of control, she says, I have a brilliant idea. I'll give my husband to my maidservant and she'll have a child and that'll be the promised child. But God clearly came along and said, that's not the promised child. You and your husband, Abraham, will have a promised child, and that's how I'm going to bless you. So you can read the story, but it's very clear that in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham's like 100 and Sarah is like 90, and they still haven't had a child. And even in Genesis 20, they are in a place called Gerar, and the king was called Abimelech. And they go, and it's in the Negev. That's the place they call it. And Abraham tells King Abimelech that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, because he was afraid that if they said he was her wife, that they would kill him because Sarah was so beautiful. Even at that age, I mean, that's something that she might have felt rejected, but she was considered still beautiful enough that this King Abimelech wanted to have her as his wife. And he took her in to be his wife. He had not laid with her. And God told Abimelech, hey, that is Abraham's wife, not his sister. It was a half lie because Sarah was his father's child, Abraham's father's child, but not his mother's child. And he lied to protect his life, and he lied to protect Sarah's life. But anyway, I digress. In the story, Abimelech is warned by God not to lay with Sarah because she was a married woman, Abraham's wife. And because Abimelech had taken Sarah to be his wife, God had shut up the wombs of Abimelech's other wives and all the maidservants in his kingdom, because he was trying to warn him, don't lay with Sarah. And at the end of Genesis chapter 20, God also asked Abraham to pray for King Abimelech and his kingdom for the wombs to be open. And I always thought that that was such an ironic story, because Abraham and Sarah still had not had a child yet. But yet Abraham was considered a prophet, and he was told by God to pray for the wombs of Abimelech's wives and his maidservants to be opened after he gave Sarah back to Abraham, restored Sarah back to Abraham. So here it is, Abraham could not have a child with his wife, but God told him to pray to open up the wombs of all the women in Abimelech's kingdom. God is just so beyond our understanding. This story is just so incredulous. But that just shows you that God had a plan 25 years after God promised Abraham that he would have a son with his wife Sarah. He still hadn't had a son. He was commanded to pray for King Abimelech for the wombs to be open in his kingdom. And him and Sarah, they still didn't have a child. And in Genesis chapter 21, it says that the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he has promised. And Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. So, even though you might feel rejected by God in a particular area, it's not a rejection. It's not the appointed time. Because God said in chapter 21, Genesis, that he had an appointed time in Abraham's old age for them to have Isaac. So there is an appointed time. When God closes one door, it doesn't mean that it's closed forever. It means that God says, not yet. So let me get back to my story. I waited from the time I was probably 27 till I was 38, almost 11 years later. And God blessed me to have children via adoption. I was able to adopt my son and my daughter. They were just a year and 2 years old, but I had them since they were like a month and a year old, the full siblings. So all those years, my 11 years, which was equivalent, a lot less than Abraham and Sarah's 25 years that they waited from Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis chapter 21. My appointed time had not come until 11 years later, just like Abraham and Sarah's appointed time didn't come until Genesis 21 to have Isaac 25 years later. So I'm here to say that even though you might feel rejected by God, especially something like fertility. I'm a woman. I thought, like, God, hey, I was born with a uterus. I was born to have a child. But yet it felt like I was being rejected because I couldn't have a child. But God chose to bless us with children via adoption, which the Bible tells us in James that true religion undefiled is to visit the widow and the orphan in their affliction. God used my husband and I as instruments for his glory to adopt children. And I feel so privileged. So I'm not rejected by God. I was chosen and selected by God to be the parents of my adopted children. And there's so much more in this story that's just incredulous. My children have met their biological parents, and you can tell that it was a setup. God meant it. There was an appointed time. And I will continue to tell you more of this testimony in future episodes. So please stay tuned and come back to always believing God. You're not been rejected. You were selected. God bless you all.